Chapter 8. Lastly, we'll be looking at liquidity analysis. We are not doing LO 8.5, the contingency portion of this chapter. So, assess liquidity using current liability ratios. So, liquidity. Liquidity refers to having sufficient cash or other current assets convertible to cash in a relatively short time on hand to pay currently maturing debts. Because a lack of liquidity can result in financial difficulties or even bankruptcy to a company, it is critical that managers, as well as outside investors and lenders, maintain close watch on a company's aspect of its well-being. We will look at 3 liquidity measures in this section: working capital, the current ratio, and the acid test ratio. All 3 measures are calculated using current assets and current liabilities. So make sure that you're understanding what is defined as a current asset and what is defined as a current liability. Working capital is simple. It's simply current assets minus current liabilities. Working capital answers the question, after paying all of our current obligations, how much do we have on hand to work with? For example, if you have $20 in your pocket and you know that you owe $10 to your friend and you owe $3 for parking, your working capital is $7. A large positive working capital is an indicator of liquidity. However, it's not the best measure of liquidity for comparing across companies because this ratio does not control for the relative size of each company. So for that, we'll look at the current ratio. The current ratio is current assets divided by current liabilities. A current asset greater than 1 indicates there are more current assets than there are current liabilities. The higher the current ratio, the greater the company's liquidity. So for example, if the ratio is 1.5, that says that for every $1 of current liabilities, the company has $1.5 of current assets. But an even better ratio is the acid test ratio, also called the quick ratio. It's similar to the current ratio, but it's based on a more conservative measure of current assets available to pay current liabilities. The quick ratio, or the acid test ratio, is cash plus current investments plus accounts receivable only divided by current liabilities. These are considered quick assets. Quick assets: cash, current investments, and accounts receivable. By eliminating other assets, current assets, such as inventory and prepaid expenses that are less readily convertible to cash, the acid test ratio may provide a better indication of a company's liquidity than the current ratio. So make sure you understand the difference between the current and the acid test. The current takes all current assets. The acid test only takes quick assets: cash, current investments, and accounts receivable. Also, you need to understand the effect of specific transactions on the current ratio and the acid test ratio. Both ratios have the same denominator, which is current liabilities. So a decrease in current liabilities will increase the ratios. If you divide by a smaller number, that makes the ratios larger. Likewise, an increase in current liabilities will decrease the ratios. Dividing by a bigger number makes the ratio smaller. How the ratios are affected by current assets depends on which current assets change. Both ratios include cash, current investments, and accounts receivable. An increase to any of these will increase both ratios. However, only the current ratio includes inventory and other current assets. An increase in inventory or other current assets will increase the current ratio, but not the acid test ratio. Make sure you're looking at this and looking over this chart to understand the various changes on the liquidity ratios. Management can influence liquidity to some extent. A company can influence the timing of inventory and accounts payable recognition by asking suppliers to change delivery schedules. That would reduce the balances in inventory and accounts payable and change the ratio. So it can happen. And the reason it might happen is because of a debt covenant. A debt covenant is an agreement between a borrower and a lender that requires certain minimum financial measures to be met, or a lender can recall the debt. So by delaying the receipt of goods until January, inventory and accounts payable could both be lowered, and that could increase a current ratio so that it meets the debt covenant, so the company then doesn't have to repay the debt. So companies and managers might work with things like this to try to keep the ratios within debt covenants. This is an example of that. They're expected in the current period ratio to be 1.25. They decide to delay the receipt of $1 million in goods until the following period. So by lowering inventory by $1 million and liabilities by $1 million, the new ratio goes up to 1.33. So if their debt covenant said that they had to have a 1.3, if they had a 1.25, they would not have been within their debt covenant, and they would have had to repay their debt. But by delaying the delivery of inventory from December to January, their ratio went up to 1.33, and they're now within their debt covenant. And that is the end of chapter 8.